A deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment. It removes fact. It tells us how things feel. Such a story permits those on both sides of the political spectrum to stand back and explore the subjective prism through which the party on the other side sees the world. And I don't believe we understand anyone's politics, right or left, without it. For we all have a deep story. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the name of our show today, The Deep Story. Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle. And within the next 56 and a half minutes, I will explain to you this concept of deep story coming from Arlie Hochschild and how this story that was written primarily to describe a condition in the United States, how it applies to us here in Austria. And I'll give various examples. And then lastly, we don't want to close the show on a sour note, so I will attempt to come up with a possible approach that could be used for us to get past this malaise. And I was at a workshop, I'm going to call it a workshop, last Saturday, and this topic came up once again. Of course, everybody is in mourning due to the results of the election on the 29th of September here. And within this group, I kept hearing, how do we speak to the other side? But interestingly enough, very often when the other side was being depicted, they were using very often the typical monikers to be found within identity politics, as if they are them and we are us, which only emphasizes the polarization. And within that workshop, it was very interesting. Kenan Günger was there. And unfortunately, I wish he would have had more time to talk about this condition. He described it in a way that I haven't heard from anyone else, certainly not in the way that he described it. And unfortunately, we didn't get to the part where we say, how do we get past it, which would have been the ultimate goal, I would think. But he described a situation where before what was considered the middle was relatively controlled, easily definable within that world that hasn't existed for a long time, where the males are the so-called breadwinners. And the main income is to come to the males, and the women would stay at home, and everybody else was on the margins. Well, within the body politic that we have today, that looks obviously much different. And that got me thinking that, based on his description, that polarization is really the wrong word to describe the current state. That we look at it in a polarized fashion is another question. But what he was describing wasn't polarization. But let's move on to this description of the deep story. And as mentioned, this comes from Arlie Hochschild, who's a sociology professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And the concept of the deep story came from a book that was published, now I'm cheating, I'm looking this up, in 2016, titled Strangers in Their Own Land. And she spent time in Louisiana, which is in the middle south of the United States. And she described the condition of various individuals that she met there. And her impetus was quite clear, coming from the bubble that is Berkeley. She was trying to figure out for herself, how can this happen? How can we have such groups? How did we get to this state? And through the conversations that she held with various individuals there, she came up with this concept. So, where do we start with the concept? We start with this idea that we are all brave citizens, we follow the rules, and we've been told, this is all part of this conditioning that we have in school, that if you follow the rules, then you will be rewarded. So you have a whole group of individuals that are standing in line, waiting for their turn at the American dream, and something went astray while waiting in line. They started to realize that this line's not moving. And you know that feeling if you are standing in line, and I think this might be the best analogy. If you are at a supermarket, well, mind you, but maybe it isn't the best analogy, because here in Austria, if you're standing in line and the line's not moving and then you start shouting, open up another cashier register. But let's assume we stand in line and the line's not moving, and then we start wondering, so how come this line's not moving? And then you have this sneaky feeling that the line is moving, but it's moving in the wrong direction. It's going backwards. And said, how can that take place? So in the example or the description that Arlie gives, she comes up with an analogy of that line moving backwards, and it's one that we understand very well, especially considering the topic of inflation seems to be number one, or one of the top three subjects. We'll probably talk about the other two in the show, definitely with migration. But they hadn't received a raise in years, which meant that the line was actually moving backwards. That means that you were receiving less money because the prices all went up. And they're thinking, there's something wrong here, because that wasn't part of the plan. We were told that if we were brave citizens, obedient citizens, and we were to stand in line, wait for our turn, then we would get that piece of the American dream. Well, you have to remember there are areas in the United States that have been suffering under this malaise for a long, long time. And I would say it was probably going back a good 50 years. And so we've had plenty of time to recognize this. And in fact, we did. We just didn't take it serious. And we thought, well, people don't have much of a choice, so they have to suck it up. But then when it seems, based on Arlie's description, the turning point was reached around the financial crisis of 2008. Because then that backward trajectory of the line went into overdrive. And the people couldn't understand we are following the rules. But then they saw how the banks were saved, although your mortgage was foreclosed. So how come the banks get to go in front of the line? There's something inherently unfair in that model. But the coup de grace was President Obama, and it had nothing to do with Obama himself, but they were trained under that old model that, as I discussed in the beginning, Gunga explained to us, that that middle has gotten much bigger. So if you're working within the old paradigm, then you're raising the question, how come he cut in line? And that's what people were believing, because they felt that he didn't stand in line and that he has no right. And there's something even worse within this analogy, as Arlie mentions. So if Obama's there, what kind of slouch does he make you feel? Meaning, you try your best, the line's going backwards, and then all of a sudden somebody who did not fall into that middle, somebody who they determined to be on the margins, all of a sudden is the leader of the country. But we don't stop there. Again, let's go back to this idea of who's in the middle in the line going backwards. So this group starts asking the question, did Obama cut in front of the line? Did he get there fairly? Because they couldn't understand how somebody who came from what they would consider to be a similar background can achieve so much. And they were raising the question of his education, because he went to Harvard Law School. And they said, well, where did he get the money to go to Harvard? And I bet you they were probably thinking, did he actually have the aptitude to go to Harvard? Arlie doesn't talk about that, but I would imagine there would be enough people who would say that this is something tied to affirmative action. Oh, and she didn't talk about affirmative action. That's a great example of cutting in front of the line. And that is one that we see within the current Supreme Court, of where all of this is being revised. But Arlie goes on to describe that situation with Obama, and they said, well, the federal government must have given him the money. And then they really had a bone to pick with Michelle Obama, because they said that, well, you got to cut in front of the line and you're angry? How can that be? You have no right to be angry. But the story continues, this idea of their deep story. Let's move on. And again, that model where we said that the middle is the white male who is the sole breadwinner. So now it's women cutting in front of the line. And how come they are able to get the jobs that were actually reserved for us? And this gets even better. Let's move on to the immigrants. Because they're all cutting in front of the line, aren't they? And don't even talk about the refugees. But the coup de grace of this deep story is, the example that she gives, is the brown pelican. And you have to remember that there was the massive oil slick, I think it was during Obama's first term, but I might be wrong, I'd say 2011, 2012, where BP had a massive oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico, and that caused all kinds of damage within not just Louisiana, but the whole Gulf Coast, Alabama, Mississippi. And now they're saying, now the brown pelican is jumping in front of the line. So they're equating this whole idea of ecology, or being ecological, in the steps that we take to combat what we call climate change and like. Well, all of these entities are jumping in front of the line. I didn't see them in the line. If anything, they should have been behind us to begin with. And the last thing we'd ever want to take care of is nature, because people have precedence. So that's Arlie's description of the deep story. And she comes up with a number of examples, and a few of them I'd like to share with you, and then we'll make the transition to how that might apply to Austria. And perhaps some of you might have already built that bridge to our current situation. It's a situation that we've had for a number of years. Let's not beautify the situation. This is nothing new, and it's not an Austrian phenomena. But we see these tendencies in a number of different countries. So, within this narrative that she gives, she talks about a situation where, let's assume you live in a small, medium-sized town. And within your town, you have probably one big employer. And I could very well imagine that at one time when things were going well, that employer was the great benefactor. And we know the stories of where big companies, when it was considered to be in vogue, would actually create the housing for their employees. But that employer has hit hard times, and that hard times can come from various sources. I'll just list a few that come immediately to mind. That they are dealing with an energy that we're trying to cut out, or they were in manufacturing, or in some sort of dirty industry, where it became much cheaper, especially starting around the 90s, that it's so much easier to just go ahead and outsource things, because one, then you don't have to deal with all those trade unions, and in essence, employees should be thankful that we were able to put a job together for them. And of course, we can save a whole slew of money if we just go ahead and outsource these activities somewhere else. And it should be noted, and we know this one in Europe very well, because this was the impetus of the enlargement, primarily in 2004 of the EU, that for us to stay competitive, we need to broaden our scope, the areas that we're covering, the number of our population within the community, because it allows us to accomplish two things. One, we have an internal market, which makes it much easier to conduct business within our territory. And secondly, the farther east we move, the cheaper the labor got. And if anybody believes the contrary, then they are sorely mistaken. That was one of the reasons why we had the expansion of the EU, and of course the next one coming falls within the same line. And I like to think there are some positive things there. Obviously, for me, there was always something positive in allowing people an opportunity. But you have that in the United States, where businesses from in the Midwest would migrate to the South because they didn't have the same labor laws, and they were getting all kinds of incentives to move their business somewhere else. So let's go back to the scenario. So you have the small, medium-sized town. Let's call it a medium-sized town with the large employer, and for some reason the employer decides to move somewhere else, or maybe the employer was no longer competitive and they went out of business. So I'm just making something up. There was maybe 6,000 employees at this company. They are no longer there. And there is no employer to fill the gap. So you have 6,000 people unemployed. That could possibly be 30-40% of the population. So what are these people supposed to do? But it gets even worse because they learned how to do something that is no longer required. And let's assume they stood in line, they saved some money, they were not looking for a handout, and all of a sudden their savings is gone. The savings gone. And if you fall within that mindset as I described, you're coming from the middle and you cannot provide for your family. Well, didn't matter that I was standing in line. Didn't matter that I was trying to be as resourceful as possible. But all of a sudden you have the sense of shame. Sense of shame. And because you have this idea that certain jobs are very gender specific, that the only jobs that are to be found within your community would be women's jobs, and they would pay about a third of what you were making before. So you cannot bring yourself to take on one of these positions. But eventually you have no choice because there's no income and you still have bills. And then you think, I have to go somewhere else where my chances are much better. So you most likely leave the family behind and you migrate to a larger town where you are thinking that your chances are going to be much better, certainly much better than where you left. So you land in a larger city. You really feel like a stranger because those things that were quite normal for you where you lived are not to be found. They are not to be found. And then you realize that those things that you know, that you call it your specialty because you've been doing it for so many years, nobody cares about that specialty. So now you have the feeling that you really don't have much to offer. But it gets even worse. So you come from this mental model of standing in line, and that by playing the rules, you will get your just rewards. And you're in an area where you're just happy to get anything. And you see so many different people, and they all seem to be doing well, and they don't fall within that center that you had as your mental model. And then you start thinking, they didn't stand in line. Somebody let them in the front of the line. So who let them in the front of the line? Well, the only institution that could have done that has to be the federal government. So then the federal government becomes the root of all evil. All evil. Justified or not. And then the resentment strikes. And you feel all alone within your story. And then all of a sudden, somebody shows up who recognizes your plight. They understand, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. And whether that individual or that group really feels your pain is neither here nor there, because they at least are recognizing you, because you do not feel that anybody knows that you exist. But at least that person does. That person knows that I exist. And then the manipulation starts. I'll give you one scenario that Arlie talks about in her second book, which is also definitely to be recommended, called Stolen Pride. And here she talks about her exploration in Pikesville, Kentucky, which is one of the poorest areas of the entire United States. And the complete name of the book is Stolen Pride, Loss, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. And within this book, Arlie describes what I'm going to call an anti-shaming ritual. And so that the Pied Piper of the disheveled starts making outlandish claims that are totally over the top. And then you have various establishment types, and primarily the media, who point out how outlandish these claims are. Because they do not see it as being correct that somebody can make such outlandish claims. Oh well. But then this individual comes back and they say, look what they're doing to me. So it's the drama triangle, folks. So the individual comes out and says, look what they're doing to me. And you have to remember, this is the prophet talking to the flock. Remember, I am standing here for you. So my shame is taking on your shame. So now we have the recognition, and you have the prophet playing victim. But payday always comes. So now the prophet comes back and lashes out at the media, lashes out at the establishment, and says, you are the ones who caused this situation. You are the perpetrators, and we will not stand for it anymore. So now the flock is standing to the side, applauding in unison to the prophet who makes these claims. And they celebrate that they are together. But there's an additional component that Arlie didn't write about in the book, but I know that she came to this conclusion. There is the celebration, because if you can take down the establishment, if you put down the media, and if you can show that you are a proper movement, then that's reason for celebration. And that would almost be the cue to take these models and apply them to the Austrian predicament. But there's one last part of this story that I'd like to tell you, then we'll move on to Austria. She talks about, this is a story that she received from one of the individuals she was interviewing in Pikesville. And they were describing that there is such a thing as a good bully and a bad bully. And of course, the bad bully would be the easy one. That would be the federal government. It would be the media. It would be all the establishment, those that I described in that anti-shaming ritual. But now you have the good bully. And the good bully is somebody who is not perfect. That this prophet is human because he, and this usually he, no, that's not true. I have to correct myself there. We have enough female examples here and here. Two in particular come to mind. That they are not perfect, and that makes them human, which means that you can identify with them because they are one of us, and we are one of them. But the good bully is the one who's fighting the bad bully, and we need those people because otherwise we cannot protect ourselves. So, recap, we stand in line because we've been conditioned to stand in line. And when somebody starts cutting in front of the line, or if the line starts moving backwards, then all hands on deck. We need to do something about it. And the groups that are accused of cutting the line, I'll come up with plenty of examples. And then, of course, that anti-shaming exercise. So, do any of you see these models applying to us here? When I think about the conversations, especially after the 29th of September, and please, no hate mail. I am only giving this as an example. This is not, I'm not professing anything. I'm just trying to describe what I see. But if you're one of the 29% who voted for a particular party here in Austria on the 29th of September, then you're going to think, well, we stood in line and now it's our turn. So what do you think those people are thinking when the first thing they hear is cordon sanitaire one more time? And even though it's all right, we're not being taken serious. And if you listen to the comments that are coming out of the political field here in Austria, you could hear that logic. And they're not talking about standing in line, but they're inferring it big time. They're definitely inferring this. And I would say that the anti-shaming exercise definitely fits into our situation, and not just ours, but we see this throughout all of Europe pretty much, some more than others. And it almost seems the more outlandish the claims, that the bigger the pushback, which actually unifies the group who feels like they're being marginalized. So my point is that we're all guilty for the proliferation here, in whatever form it may be, in pointing out the falsehoods, the problems with this mental model from 40 years ago or 50 years ago that doesn't apply anymore. And we don't want to have this world. But we seem to have this uncanny habit of always giving these groups the ammunition, and really, very often, all they're really looking for is somebody to understand their plight. So I'm going to make up a story here and see to what degree I can come up with an analogy that actually fits our situation. So within this story, this is all imaginary, although I see it as being extremely plausible. Let's assume you have somebody who is coming. Before I get started, describe the geographical location. We'll be talking about somewhere in Middle Burgenland and Vienna. And you have somebody coming from Middle Burgenland, and there was never really much work to be found to begin with. But one of the factories, probably a bit of an exaggeration, that we had in town closed due to this downward spiral that we seem to experience in the countryside, and this is not an Austrian phenomena, where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Youth can't find jobs, so they leave the small town. The small town doesn't have enough employees, so then the businesses close up. And then it's just a race to the bottom because you have no more youth. All you have are older people in this town. You have no more shops. And very often you don't even have a place for people to meet, being in a bar or a restaurant, a third place where people can at least talk about their plight. And if you're not familiar with the situation, it's about high time you do. But let's assume this person from Middle Burgenland, there's nothing to be found even close to where they live. So now they're compelled to look for work in Vienna. And of course they can never afford to live in Vienna. So that means that they will need to commute every day between Middle Burgenland and Vienna. And if you've ever tried public transportation going to these areas, you will know exactly what I'm talking about, because very often there are no trains, and buses are sporadic at best. And I hope I don't get any hate mail from the province of Burgenland, but I'm afraid that people have cars for a reason, because the public transportation leaves very often something to be desired. And obviously, I don't mean to pick on one area, but it's a big issue in the countryside, something that us city people have difficulties in understanding. And don't even think about taking a car into Vienna, because there's no place to park, because we have laws that basically makes it impossible to bring your car in. And I think it's a good thing. But that makes it very difficult for those people who have to commute. So that person is able to get a job in the supermarket, but that means that they have to wake up by 3:30, maybe 4 o'clock, to catch the only bus that's going to take them into Vienna. And very possibly, it's not just one bus, they have to change somewhere, to get in to work by 7 o'clock, because the store will open by, some are opening already by 7:15. And then you have to perform the exercise going the other way around. So you need your 2 hours, and oh my gosh, when we missed the connection, I had to stay overtime. That meant it took me even longer to get back home. And then, of course, I can look forward to repeating the exercise the next day. So that individual shows up in Vienna and looks around and sees people that seem to have all kinds of time to lounge around and do whatever they want. And then you start to raise the question, so what's the fairness in this? And actually, I'd love to spare the commute. I don't really want to live here because my home is somewhere else. I don't know anybody here apart from the colleagues. And I'll get a couple nice people that will treat me fairly, the customers. But for the most part, I am all on my lonesome here. But what about all these foreigners, right? Who are coming in and they seem to be able to get an apartment. How come they were able to cut in front of the line? And then when you start thinking it from that perspective, again, please, no justification. I'm just trying to explain how people are thinking. Then you start to understand how their deep story actually looks. So they're thinking, how come all these people get all this stuff and I have to spend 4 hours commuting for a crappy job? So what are they feeling? Very possibly they're feeling shame because they're having to do something that they feel that they could be doing so much more. But unfortunately, they weren't given the best of cards on day one, that being birth, of where they live and the options that they had. So they have to make decisions, figure out some way to make do. Who are they being influenced by? Well, certainly the prophet I described, who is telling them, I feel your pain, and my shame is your shame. And it's not fair, and we need to do something about it. And so how do they deal with it? Well, they look at every day, one at a time, and they're trying to figure out some way to survive. They're trying to survive. So can we have internal migrants? Sure we do. We have plenty ever since I've been living here. Because I was hearing the story of people having those types of commutes for years, because there were no other possibilities where they were living. But at that time, they were probably thinking, well, you know what, I'm just standing in line and I will save my money, and then when I saved up enough money, then we'll go ahead and build our house at home. And that was pretty much the model. So they felt that they were standing in line by performing this commute because they were being very diligent, and they knew that at the end they would have enough so that they can thrive. And that thriving might only come after they stop working. And we know how turbulent the work situation has become over the last 30, 40, if you came from the United States, I would say 50 years, where that concept of having the same job your entire life became a very rare commodity, and for whatever reason it might be. So can we see our deep story where we live here? Can we see how the situation is being utilized by different groups? And can we see that we are on that same trajectory of that of what Arlie Hochschild was writing about? And very often I'll have conversations with people, and they'll throw up their hands and say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Well, I'm going to make some suggestions here. And I'm not making a claim that any of this is easy. But one thing's for sure, the alternative is always much worse. So here we go. Apart from the fact that we have no clue as to the condition of these people that we keep talking about, as what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables, which was one of the things that we remember from the 2016 election, was Hillary Clinton and the claim of deplorables, which was worn as a badge of honor for Trump's forces. And they say, welcome to the deplorables. So we have no idea what it's like for these people and how they got to this particular point in time. And if we believe that very often it's situation based, and it's a topic I talk about a lot on the show. I'm not me, myself, and I. There's only me here. That I talk about the situational and dispositional. I think it very much applies here, because very often, if you think about it, when we're talking about our Austrian deplorables, what we're saying is they were born that way. That's what we're saying. And we have difficulty in understanding that very often that people are caught in a situation and they don't know how to get out of it. And we're not helping them get out of it either. But for us to actually provide any type of help, and actually these people are not looking for a handout. They're not looking for a handout. Their first step is that they want to be taken seriously and respected as human beings, which is something that we should think about everybody falling within that category. I don't care where they come from and which condition they are in. And it's all easier said than done. But because we have no connection, either from group A to B or B to A, makes no difference. What we need to do is figure out a safe space where we can meet without any judgment. And I would say let's leave the fact-based element out, because that's just a weapon that we use against the others. And we utilize our listening capabilities and just let them talk. Let them talk. But the problem is that we can't just go up to people and say, I'm keen on your story. Can you tell me your story? Because if it was me, I would think that somebody's trying to take the mickey out of me, right? Because there's no trust. So the first step what we need to take is figuring out some way to establish trust. And here I'm going to make a proposal to all of you. Look in your community. Do you know of anybody who can act as the bridge between groups A and B? And that those people that could be the bridge, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud, maybe the people who act as the bridge came from a certain environment where they made a conscious decision that they were going to better themselves. And within that decision, they ended up moving away. And no doubt had to make compromises. And probably never really felt at home where they decided to settle. But they came to the conclusion, well, that's the price I have to pay for progressing in the society. But maybe somebody like that could act as the bridge to that other group. Because somebody has to initiate it, and they have to be trusted by both sides. And it's almost like if we say that this person came from Group A and was able to establish themselves in Group B, well, the funny thing about it is the people in Group B are going to say, but actually you're one of us. Whereas that person probably never really truly felt that they were part of Group B because they knew that they came from Group A. But they were able to put on a good show. But at least there would be no question. In fact, it reminds me of a story that I heard in my professional life that I've had employers that look to put me in charge of talking to the Americans. At one time they said that, yeah, because if you talk to them, they will think that you are one of them, and by the time they find out that you're not, it will be too late. That was what it directly told to me, and I thought it was quite funny, and I think it almost applies here, right? So we have that person who acts as the bridge, and then we set the ground rules, how that conversation takes place. And we're not talking about politics, we're talking about their deep story. We want to hear their deep story. And very possibly, when we hear their deep story, that might act as a trigger to our own deep story. Because that deep story is the humanity part of this all. And that's what we need to strive towards, folks. We need to strive towards the human part. We're talking about human beings. And we shouldn't forget that. They're not independent entities, and they're not the deplorables. They are human beings. So, let's stay with that analogy. Once we are able to build the bridge, and you start listening to people, then you start to develop some sort of empathy and understanding their plight. And very often you'll say, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't even think that was possible. Because because it's not part of your world, right? So how does that story continue? If we can set up multiple groups of where we just start with a conversation, where we allow the other person to talk, and we are there to listen and to reflect on that of what they talk about, where do you think that will take us? Well, we look at them as humans now, so they are not deplorables. Because if they are deplorables, then we are too, because we're human as well. And very possibly, obviously we won't agree with what's always being said, but at least you'll understand why, and perhaps you might even be able to come up with a solution to counteract it. But not in an offensive way, but in a helping way. And then you get to the point of saying, but actually, we all have the same goals. So why are we fighting each other? How can we find ways to cooperate? And then we are on our way to create that pluralistic society that I think a lot of us would love to have. But it seems to be continuously elusive. Because in that ideal world that I want to have is that everyone's treated with respect, we try our best to understand their story, we stop condemning them for this cockamamie idea that they were born this way. And then we try to come up with that common identity where we include everybody. And then we can, at that point in time, I think we have a much better chance of putting finally to rest this idea coming from the 50s of this convoluted model, because that excluded so many different people, and that cannot be our goal. That cannot be our goal. So let's remember what our real goal is, and that's to create that pluralistic society. And anything we can do to help us along that way is, in my mind, a very good thing. And again, as always, we're reaching the end of the show. So I'm hoping I was able to give you some ideas of how we can better understand where the others are coming from, understanding this model. And maybe you might find something of use, and for us to get past this malaise. Thanks as always. Have a wonderful week.